Hello, everyone. So I'm from Somewhere Cooperative Housing Association. We're based in Bedminster in South Bristol. We've been around since 1979, and I've actually been a member of the co-op almost since the beginning, not quite from the beginning. I'm also a tenant, and I'm also the treasurer of the co-op. I'm also quite aware of a number of other small housing co-ops in Bristol and their more recent experience. So if you want to know about that, I can probably answer some questions about it. But I'm just going to put on my presentation, hopefully. Right. Now we've got past the technical hitches. So Somewhere started in 1979. It was started by a group of people who were involved in squatting or were in very poor rented housing. And they were generally people who were looking to take control of their own housing. They were very interested in common ownership and to have shared facilities. I put this picture up because this is a picture of that era. This is from a book called Radical Technology, which was published in the late 1970s. And I think it kind of typifies a kind of image of what we were about when we started, was the idea of renovating older houses, creating shared gardens and shared facilities, and living together. We were aided in the early days by Solon, which is a big housing association. They gave us a lot of assistance, a lot of technical support, professional support, but most importantly, they leased us a house. And that house had 4 flats in it. And for the 3 years that we had it, it enabled us to gain housing management experience, and we also became a housing association in our own right. And that gave us access to something that then existed, doesn't exist anymore, called Housing Association Grant, which basically gave you the money to improve and reconfigure properties, and also gave you access to a cheap mortgage. And with Housing Association Grant, we actually acquired 5 fairly large houses in Bedminster. And these are the 5 houses which we still have. And in fact, last week, we actually paid off the mortgage on the last of those 5 houses. So we actually own outright all of these 5 houses. 2 of them remain as single properties, 3 of them have been divided into flats. But this provided a basis for our co-op and gave us a good stable basis. But Housing Association Grant disappeared, and we were quite stuck about how to develop after that. So in the 1990s, mid-1990s, we became aware that there was this little terrace of houses opposite Windmill Hill City Farm, which had been partly used for short life housing, belonged to the city council. The housing association that was using them for short life was moving out, and the Bristol Energy Centre, which had the others, was also moving out. And so we registered our interest in them, and we took over the leases of these 5 houses. They were not in very good condition. They still need improving, but they gave us another growth spurt, enabling us to increase our numbers by about 1/3. And it was, a reasonable deal at the time. But they were all on very short leases, which is not great for housing management or for investing in improving them. And we were still looking for ways of widening our portfolio of housing. We had quite a few people who were in housing that was no longer appropriate to them. And so we were trying to look at ways in which we could further develop. And for that reason, we started looking at new build as an option. And partly because the very end house in this terrace, the little pink one at the end, had a very large garden beside it. And we thought, here's a piece of land on which we could develop, providing the city council will play ball and we can negotiate a new situation here. So we spent 5 years putting together a project. And the reason it took 5 years was we were in a period of austerity, and we had to persuade the city council that they were willing, first of all, to give us a good long lease on all of the houses. And we've negotiated a 50-year lease now on all of the houses and on the plot of land. And also to get their consent to allow us to build. That was the thing that sort of made it possible for us then to go out and seek the finance to do it, and to find the builders and the architect and the rest of it to actually make it happen. It was very significant when we had a change of administration in City Council. Paul Smith, who is the councillor, deputy mayor responsible for housing, made a very big commitment towards trying to find new ways of bringing in social housing, and we jumped on him when he arrived, and I have to say he responded extremely well, and it was through him that the project really moved forward. It did actually have to go and get clearance from the Houses of Parliament for us to actually have these houses and this plot of land on the terms that we did, because they were very favourable terms to us. And in terms of using a public asset, actually had to have parliamentary approval. So as a co-op, we then were looking at what do we need in the way of housing. And just to say that somewhere operates by a general meeting, there is no management committee. So all members can attend a general meeting. We have those every 3 weeks. We get very good attendance. We nearly always have over half the membership actually at a meeting. And they are people are well involved in actually running the co-op. We have a paid administrator who works a couple of days a week. We also have a paid maintenance coordinator who again works maybe 1 day a week. But the rest of the work is done on a voluntary basis by members of the housing co-op. I have the role of treasurer, which I have to say actually doesn't involve very much, since our administrator does most of the account and bookkeeping. But I have been very involved in sort of long-term financial planning for the co-op. So as a co-op, we were in a position where we had quite a lot of people who'd been in the co-op for quite include myself in that. I was actually living in a 3-bedroom house after my children had grown up and moved away. And this wasn't very good use of the housing. And we did a sort of housing needs analysis. Everybody said what they wanted, whether they wanted to stay where they were, whether they wanted to move. We actually identified effectively 7 households who wanted something different. And we looked at various configurations for our new development. And we came to the conclusion that what we needed was 3 apartments mainly geared for older members of the co-op in order to free up family homes for younger members of the co-op. And we have members stretching from their early 20s through to old geezers like me. So this little chart here is option C, which is what we went for. And it literally identified who might be living in the houses after we moved everybody around and did a grand shuffle. The development, obviously, you have to get planning permission for it. And strangely, the things that were most difficult in terms of planning, and on the whole they weren't that difficult, was that we wanted to share things. We wanted to share where we put our bikes, for instance. So the new development actually has a bike store in it, and it actually stores the bikes for the whole terrace, not just for the 3 apartments. And our rubbish, for instance, we said, well, we only need probably 2 dustbins between us, and no, the planners wouldn't have that. We have to have a dustbin for everybody. I have to say we haven't actually done that. You can see we've only got 2 dustbins, and that's actually shared with the house next door as well. So we actually make very good use of our rubbish storage. Oops, sorry, I've gone past. Let's click that. Yes, there we go. The other issue was that we were going to chop down trees in the garden where we were going to build the property, and the planners wanted £7,000 of us to replace the trees that we were chopping down. We thought this was a bit steep, especially since several of us had actually been involved in tree planting. And so we negotiated with City Farm across the road, and we planted the trees there. And this is Bill, who is actually our oldest member, digging a hole with the help of some chickens to plant a tree. We got an extremely good architect for our development. It's a guy called Taus Larson. He had been working with Bill Dunster on the BedZ project in London, which people might know about as being rather iconic low energy development. So Taus was setting himself up as an independent architect, and this was his first project. And I have to say, he's been utterly brilliant as an architect to work with. He's been really responsive to us as a membership and what we wanted, and really involved us in designing the properties. He came up with a really good basic design, but when it came down to the detail, the people who were actually going to live in these properties could literally decide a lot of the basic things about where the lights were, how big the kitchen was, how big the bathroom might be, etc., etc. And this is my living room and bathroom on the first floor of my dwelling. So I had a full role in actually helping to do the design work. Obviously, another key part to all of this is actually getting the money together. The co-op, because it had been going a long time, had actually got quite a lot of its own assets. So we actually put up a third of the money for this development from our own bank account, basically. The rest we got on a mortgage. And I have to say, this was actually one of the most difficult bits of the whole development. We weren't expecting it to be. We thought it was going to be fairly straightforward because we'd been negotiating with the bank to actually get the money for some time. But when it boiled down to it, it actually took us 5 months to actually get the mortgage finally approved. And by that time, we were actually building. So it was a little bit of sweat developed there, but it all came right in the end, thank God. We were also aided by the fact that we have a green builder as one of our members, and his company actually took on the management of the project. But we had 3 stages to the project, sort of doing the groundworks. And this is just next door to 101 Phillip Street, which is one of the existing houses. It's a very tight little space to work in. The ground workers in particular struggled at times to get their machinery and the rest of it into it. Our first big hitch in sort of good grand designs mode was that the ground on which we were building was very unstable. It was a former clay pit and was just filled with old rubble. And so when they came to test the ground, they put a test drill into it, and it just whizzed down through the ground, which was quite alarming. And it meant that really it wasn't at all stable. So we actually spent £10,000 more than anticipated on putting some rather large piles, 8 meters long, into the ground before we hit something solid. We went for fairly modular type design. This is the floor going in, which went in one day. It was all craned in and slotted together, complete with all the insulation already in it.
Another 5 minutes, Trevor.
Oh, that's fine. And then we went for a timber frame prefabricated construction, And here you can see the whacking great crane we had, which we managed to negotiate with our neighbours to have that sitting in their car park. And it hoisted in the sections of the timber frame, and here it is being put together. It was quite a remarkable thing for us to see. Like, the whole thing went up in 2 weeks, and was very exciting, because basically at the end of it we had the shell of a building, just like that, it felt like. And then our member Ben and his company came in and actually fitted this out, and that was the longest part of the process. That took about 7 months, but the whole thing was done in under a year, and so was quite a slick process, I have to say. Co-op members were involved in actually doing some of the work. We did some of the unskilled work, and here we've got co-op members actually insulating the inside of the property. There was one heck of a lot of insulation. There's over a foot of insulation all the way around the building. And this is when we opened it in June last year. That is Councillor Paul Smith in the middle doing the opening. We thought we'd give him full credit for all the assistance he gave to us. Ben, our builder, is next door, and next door to him is Taos, our architect. And yeah, it was a great day. And this is what we've ended up with. It's a really lovely place. It's great. It very low energy design. It has 10 kilowatt solar panel on the roof. It has air source heat pump to heat the water. There's almost no space heating requirement because it's almost passive house standard. It's very cheap on the bills. And as a co-op, we have a policy of very cheap rents. So I have a 1-bedroom apartment in this dwelling, and it cost me £400 a month. Out the back, we have a nice sort of setup here. My 2-story part of apartment is on the left-hand side of this, and then there are 2 flats on single floors, and one of them's got this rather nice balcony. And we share a garden with the house next door, which is also part of the co-op. So the garden is shared between 4 properties. And during recent times, that has been the project that has kept everybody sane, is actually developing the garden. This is where I live. This is my own dwelling. I actually have my living room on the 1st floor. This is a kitchen which I actually built myself, and that's one of the nice things about living in a co-op. You can do things like that. And it has a beautiful outlook looking out over the allotments of the Windmill Hill City Farm. So a very pleasant place to be. And I'd say that's one of the key things about living in the co-op is I would say you have almost as much control as a house owner living here. You don't have the financial responsibility of it. You're paying a rent, and it's up to the co-op to actually find the money for doing all the maintenance work, which we've done successfully over the years. But as long as you can get your other members to agree, you can do most things within reason within your house, and it makes it a very good place to live. So I'd grown, I had my whole life as a family man, and now as a retired man, because I retired a couple of months ago. So be very happy to answer any questions about that. And also, as I said, I am quite familiar with a lot of the small housing co-ops that are setting up now in Bristol, which have maybe a slightly different story. But I'd emphasise with this development, it was crucial that we actually have the city council on board and that they provided the land effectively for doing this development. Financially, it wouldn't have stacked up without that. Anyhow, I'll finish there.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Trevor. Great. Okay, so I think we should go straight into some questions. So I've got, first off, Brenda, you have raised your hand. So I'm going to see if I can let you talk. Be interesting. I love this bit.
Hello.
Hello, Brenda.
Hi. Really, a couple of questions for Colin. It's about how you interpret the term affordability. Is that up to the co-op? How you define that term? And I just wondered whether there are many examples of urban community land trusts that we could hear about or look up. That's it.
Cool, thank you. I've unmuted you, Colin.
Yeah, okay, I've unmuted myself now. So I think there were two questions there. One was about affordability. And I guess Trevor's already mentioned that, and I don't know if Trevor might want to comment on how that's interpreted by other co-ops that he knows about. But I think the question of affordability in general is very thorny, because as we touched on in our previous webinars, there's a kind of a term, affordable, which has been coined, I guess, mainly by government. And the current running definition of that seems to be that if it's 20% or more below the prevailing local market rate, so in the case of rented property, that would be 80% of the private sector rent that might be charged on that property, then it is affordable. Another way of looking at what is affordable is, of course, what can people actually afford? And there's a whole range of different answers there, at the lowest end of which, I guess, is what will the benefit system support, where people are entirely dependent on benefits, and somewhere in between are, what are local people earning, and with or without some benefits, what can they afford as a result? So I think the answer to the question of what is affordable is, the probably how many participants we got? We've got 34 participants in the webinar at this moment in time, and between us we've probably got 40 different answers to what is affordable. I think that Trevor's demonstrated that you need to look at the economics of each scheme, and in our case we're able to come up with outcome rents that people felt that were affordable for them. And I think from the point of view of housing associations, local authorities and other housing professionals, I think we tend to look at it in terms of which part of the community isn't currently being serviced by all of the various types of housing that are out there. What are their incomes? What's their wherewithal? What can they afford? And therefore, what do we need to do to produce housing that would meet that particular niche? I very, very quickly want to touch on the other question you had was about community land trusts and urban examples. And I think I'm going to dodge that one and say, why don't you come to our community land trust webinar, because we're supposed to be talking about housing costs.
Thank you.
Could I perhaps just also respond? There is a community land trust here in Bristol, and it's quite active and is doing some schemes. I would just say on affordability, it's always been our policy to try and keep rents as low as we can for our members. Certainly housing benefit levels is what we aim to be able to be under. As a housing association, our rents are actually controlled now, so we don't have much latitude around that. But I know that a number of new housing co-ops are trying to meet that, but at the other end of things, they've also got to be financially viable. And so there's quite a tension there between those two things. And in Bristol, I would think that my rent now is anything between a half and a third of a commercial rent for the property that I live in.
Great. I think Tim, you mentioned that you've raised a hand. Want to add to that?
Actually, this is a question for Trevor. Could you say something about the way in which the assets of the co-op are protected? So my understanding is that your co-op is fully mutual, as in all of the assets are owned by the cooperative rather than by members in the form of some kind of limited equity. There are examples both in this country and in Scandinavia, where cooperatives have seen members sort of demutualize. And I was just interested in what sort of protections you have in place to make sure that the members of the co-op can't essentially cash in on the properties that you have.
Yes, well, it has been a concern, and we've seen what we might describe as carpet bagging in a number of co-ops around the country, and being very aware of that. We've been aided both by the Federation of Housing Co-ops and groups, other co-ops who have actually put into their rules clauses which actually prevent that, in terms of a few members effectively taking control of the co-op and then using properties to for their own advantage. So we hope that we are covered against that, but it always is a bit of a legal minefield, and actually making that really watertight. We think we're okay. I would say that the thing that we have faced in the past, which has, you know, really affected us, is the right to buy. Currently, co-ops are exempted from the right to buy, and rightly so. But we have actually lost a house and a flat to the right to buy in the past, which, given the number of properties that we have, is quite damaging.
Great. Okay, let's move on to, I've got a question from David, and he's asking, what were the problems with getting the mortgage? Would this apply to all co-op developments?
Yeah, I think there is, one of the big things is banks actually understanding how a co-op works, and the entity that they're dealing with. And despite the fact that the bank that we were dealing with supposedly had quite a lot of contact with co-ops, there were times when you did wonder. I think the other thing is, since the banking crisis, the regulation of banks has become much stricter, and their requirements in actually making sure that they're loaning money to a body that is capable of paying it back is become much more onerous. And we hadn't really anticipated how much they would want to know, and in how much detail. And so that's what took up the best part of the 5 months we spent negotiating with them to actually get the mortgage agreed. So I think I would say the understanding of how a cooperative works and what it is as a legal entity, because you know, there have been times when you kind of, they were trying to treat us more or less like a large family, as opposed to a legal entity, which is a company in its own right. And so it was, yeah, at times a little bizarre trying to sort that out.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Colin, have you had any experience of groups going through that process as well?
I won't comment on other people's local difficulties. I mean, I just say I'm not surprised that securing the mortgage was one of the most difficult parts of the process for Trevor and his group. I mean, it's not uncommon for lenders to you know, do a double take at anything that they've not come across before. There are certain lenders who specialise in, or I shouldn't say specialise, but have done you know, loans to different types of community housing groups. And just to break my own rule there, I'd say it's not just housing co-ops. Other forms of community-led housing that a lender hasn't come across before or isn't so familiar with will also have these problems. And it may even be that you've got a very good relationship with one member of a particular bank, but they have to pass it up to some other section, and the other section understand what it is you're doing, and their first reaction is, if you don't understand this, it's a higher risk. So there's a bit of education to be done by the movement, by us as a hub, and by our fellow hubs across the country, to help, you know, not just housing co-ops, but all forms of community-led housing in accessing more let's say, more straightforward finance.
We need to make a guide for banks that gives them a really hand-holding walkthrough. Great, I'll put that on my list of things to do.
Yes, do that.
Great. Okay. So another question from, and this is really helpful because this is a point where we can mention. I've got a question from Thomas, and it's about sort of researching for the right model and who to ask for help. So I'll read that in just a second, but it's just to point out, if you're from outside the Wessex area, you also most likely will have a hub that covers your geographical area, and you can find that. What I'll do with a follow-up email is put a link to Community-Led Homes, which is a really helpful organisation that one of the things they do is point you to your local hub, and they will all have advisors and people who can help you, signpost you to what you might need to know in your local area, the resources you might need, etc. But I'll read out the question from Thomas because he's, with his group, been looking in a couple of different areas across the UK. And he says, I am a group of 8 people, part of a group of 8 people, who are looking to start a housing co-op. We have been researching the various legal structures and financial models, and we are looking for a model that allows individuals and couples in our group to have equity in the property we live in, but also enables the co-op itself to control assets collectively on our behalf. Where do you think would be a good source of advice on this? So yeah, besides sort of first port of call being your local hub and getting in touch, yeah, have you got any pointers for good resources?
So Radical Roots is a source of information, which is effectively an organisation run by a number of housing co-ops, serving housing co-ops, and they have in the past had a group called Catalyst providing advice, but I've got a feeling that Catalyst is not quite there as it used to be. I would say that in terms of like financing co-ops these days, like the most common models are either to try and do some kind of share offer or to do basically loan agreements, and that might be with friends and family of the co-op members, or indeed even some of the co-op members themselves. So there is the chance of actually putting the money into a housing co-op, but then the relationship between that and you being a member and a tenant of the co-op can be totally separated out, because you're dealing with the entity of the co-op as a whole. That's the co-op is taking out the loan. It's up to the co-op to repay it. It's not down to the individuals. So amongst the co-ops that I know have been set up in the last few years, it's mainly been that, in fact, has been the way that they've actually raised the money, or it might be in combination with getting a small mortgage.
Yeah, perhaps I could add something. So when the idea of community land trusts was first introduced to this country, it's about 20 years ago. It was introduced in a report called Common Ground for Mutual Home Ownership. And the report was put out by the New Economics Foundation and a secondary cooperative called CDS Cooperatives. And it promoted this idea of mutual home ownership, which Colin mentioned in his slides. And the idea there was that you would have a community land trust that would own the land, and you would have a limited equity cooperative, which would then lease the land. It would get a collective mortgage, it would develop the housing, and then people would become members of the co-op and have a combination